everyone, welcome back to the channel. Now this video is another in the series that I'm doing on Dunmore's War, but it's also going to discuss something important in the context of the American Revolution on its own. Last video we discussed the Camp Charlotte Agreement, and if you missed that or any of the others and you want to catch up on Dunmore's War, I will put a link to a playlist up here in the corner so that you can do that. This video is going to be a little bit shorter though, just so that it's the Fort Gower Resolves on their own, in case that's really the only thing you're interested in. So I mentioned before that the First Continental Congress was going on at the same time as all of these events, the same time as the Battle of Point Pleasant and Camp Charlotte. The colonists who fought in Dunmore's War, they know that all of this is going on. They have that in the back of their minds. They know that they might be finishing an Indian war only to go home and fight a war against Great Britain. Dunmore had sent Lewis's army back south, and then after the Camp Charlotte Agreement, he marched his men back home by way of Fort Gower. I mentioned it slightly before, because this is a fort on the Ohio River where Dunmore was located when Cornstalk attacked Point Pleasant. And Fort Gower is roughly modern-day Hockingport, Ohio, if you want to look it up on a map. When they arrived there, the officers of the Northern Division decided they needed to have a chat. Now, the officers aren't certain what they're going to be returning home to. What will the Continental Congress have announced in their absence? Is there, more bad news from Great Britain? They have no idea. Earlier in the year, the Boston Port Act had outraged colonists all over. And yeah, the Northern Division had been off fighting American Indians, but they'd been doing it for a royal governor. So everyone's feeling kind of emotionally confused in a way, because there's multiple disputes going on and there's some kind of switched, crossed motivations, I guess you could say. This is a dispute, Dunmore's War that is a dispute that is tied to conflicting land claims between Virginia and Pennsylvania. So these officers, they basically decided that it was a good time to state their loyalties, put it in writing, just so all of their fellow colonists would be aware of their thoughts and not misconstrue their actions. The Fort Gower Resolves, as tradition has called them, were approved unanimously by the officers gathered there. And while one would think that Dunmore was aware of what was going on in his own ranks, he didn't stop it. Maybe he didn't think he could. We don't know. Once the resolves were agreed to, Lieutenant Colonel Angus MacDonald, the same MacDonald who led the expedition against Wakatamika and the other upper Shawnee towns, he took a copy to the Virginia Gazette to be published. He arrived in Williamsburg December 17th of 1774, and over the next couple months, the resolves were republished in newspapers all over the colonies. I found evidence that they were reprinted in papers in Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and North Carolina. So, all over the place. And in my thesis, I just kind of pulled out a couple key quotes. But I also put in a transcript of the Fort Gower Resolves in appendix in the back, and I can't really do that on the video. So, because it's not something that's readily available on the internet, I did want to read several paragraphs out for y'all to really get a good idea of what the Fort Gower Resolve said. So, quote, "Having now concluded the campaign by the assistance of Providence with honor and advantage to the colony and ourselves, it only remains that we should give our country the strongest assurance that we are ready at all times, to the utmost of our power, to maintain and defend her just rights and privileges. We have lived about 3 months in the woods without any intelligence from Boston or from the delegates at Philadelphia. It is possible, from the groundless reports of designing men, that our countrymen may be jealous of the use such a body would make of arms in their hands at this critical juncture. That we are a respectable body is certain, when it is considered that we can live weeks without bread or salt, that we can sleep in the open air without any covering but that of the Canopy of Heaven, and that our men can march and shoot with any in the known world. Blessed with these talents, let us solemnly engage to one another, and our country in particular, that we will use them to no purpose but for the honor and advantage of America in general, and of Virginia in particular. It behooves us then, for the satisfaction of our country, that we should give them our real sentiments by way of resolves at this very alarming crisis." end quote. So then they kind of go on to explain their process in drawing up the resolves and how it was agreed to unanimously, which I already mentioned. And then they say, quote, resolved that we will bear the most faithful allegiance to His Majesty King George III, whilst His Majesty delights to reign over a brave and free people, that we will, at the expense of life and everything dear and valuable, exert ourselves in support of the honor of His crown and the dignity of the British Empire. But, as the love of liberty and attachment to the real interests and just rights of America outweigh every other consideration, we resolve that we will exert every power within us for the defense of American liberty, and for the support of her just rights and privileges, not in any precipitate, riotous, or tumultuous manner, but when regularly called forth by the unanimous voice of our countrymen. Resolved, that we entertain the greatest respect for His Excellency, the Right Honourable Lord Dunmore, who commanded the expedition against the Shawnees, and who, we are confident, underwent the great fatigue of this singular campaign from no other motive than the true interest of this country, end quote. Now, there were a number of people who ended up doubting Dunmore's intentions, but that's not really the point in this particular video. And I've already covered how these resolves, they were intended for their fellow colonists, and they spread throughout the colonies in the newspapers rather quickly. But do you know who else saw them? Parliament. In March of 1775, the Marquis of Rockingham, he speaks in Parliament, and he brings up the quote-unquote military league of Dunmore's Northern Division officers, and how they were willing to, quote, defend American liberty with the sword, end quote. So he calls the resolves truly alarming. And, you know, for us looking back at the period, this is fascinating. But, you know, had individual counties or towns or what have you written at this point to declare their willingness to defend liberty? Yeah, sure. Plenty had before this. But what makes this different is that this is a military body. They are here as officers. Remember, America didn't have their own standing army at this time, obviously, because the first part of the revolution is, you know, Washington trying to kind of get all these people together and figure out what the heck they're doing. So to have a military body at Fort Gower, men of military experience, not speaking as farmers or lawyers or what have you, but specifically as officers, to have them declare their willingness, that's important. If you want to hear about the other resolutions or resolves, it's kind of different words are used depending on what county we're talking about. But those of the Southern Division, those were done on behalf of the individual counties. So they did not get together as officers as well. They are still fascinating though, really interesting verbiage. I will put a link up here because I already did a video on those actually. I think it was in the fall. So if you want to check that out, that's available to you. But I really just wanted to emphasize Fort Gower because these details about, you know, the officers and the nature of how it was written really does set it apart, and yet it's so hard. You really don't find much mention of it at all online, and to actually find the words of it is even less common. So thank you so much for watching. In the description box below, I will put a transcript of the full Fort Gower Resolves if you would like to check that out and read through it. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already to support the channel. Let me know your thoughts below, and I think we're gonna pretty much conclude with Dunmore's War in the next video when we talk about the treaty at Fort Pitt. So thanks again, and I will see y'all in the next video.